Today, we're going to be talking about a video asking the age-old question, why are atheists angry at God? Of course, you've heard this one a million times, but I'm always convinced, some part of me, that there's going to be something new this time. So let's watch it and find out if there actually is.
I recently saw a clip of an exchange between a street evangelist and a crowd of people that he was trying to evangelize. And at one point, an older man introduced his own contribution to the exchange by offering his own version of the problem of pain argument against the existence of God. And his
The problem of pain argument? Yeah, I don't think I've heard that one before.
remark was something like, how can God allow 6 million Jews to get murdered during the Holocaust? How can he sit by and do nothing when innocent children are abused in horrific ways or die of terrible diseases? And before the evangelist was able to respond, because this was supposed to be an interactive format, the man with the objection turned his back and walked away, refusing to listen to whatever answer might come.
Probably because there is no good answer to that kind of thing. Now, let's assume that we are both in the position to be able to stop a Holocaust. We watch it happen. Are we good people? Are we people worthy of admiration for just watching it happen? Or should we have perhaps done something about that? See, I think you can apply these standards to God just the same. If God watches something he has the power to stop, as bad as the Holocaust, especially happening to his chosen people, what does that say of him?
And it was clear that he was angry. He was gesturing aggressively, raising his voice, and in the end, he was too angry to wait for any kind of a response. And I don't think, and this is based on my own experience, which is quite extensive, that this kind of thing is exceptional. That conversations about the existence of God can evoke this kind of emotional response, which is strange when you really think about it, right? Like,
No, it's not strange, considering the amount of influence the fans of God have over our lives. And not just our lives. I mean, in Louisiana, they've recently, I think, passed a bill that would put the Ten Commandments in public schools. Schools that, if I lived in Louisiana, my tax dollars would be paying for. I would effectively be paying to brainwash my children. So you can imagine why this sort of thing gets heated. And it is incomprehensible that anybody, any sort of person, would allow something like the Holocaust to happen. There is just no way to justify that. It just isn't.
imagine if two pundits were debating who they thought should be, I don't know, like the rookie of the year in Major League Baseball, and without really listening to the other person, one of them just spent most of his time and effort personally ridiculing and denouncing the other person, and then eventually just stormed away without listening to any kind of a response. If you were a witness to that
Well, I mean, that kind of thing happens all the time, and nobody seems to really care all that much. Just one of those weird things you expect of the sports ball fans.
kind of interaction, wouldn't you likely conclude that the enraged pundit was informed more by some personal resentment than reason and logic? And what I
Not necessarily, I would just say that he has very strong opinions, very strong feelings, something like that, which is perfectly reasonable. I mean, why are atheists expected to be just like totally apathetic to everything? Why is there this terrible double standard on us that we are not allowed to care about things? Christians get super emotional over stuff like abortion, and that's fine. But when an atheist gets emotional over the Holocaust, and people like you trying to say, well, there was a good reason for it, probably, that's not fine.
find with a significant sample size of atheists, which I've been exposed to in this kind of work, is that they don't just disagree with certain doctrines of religion like Christianity, they hate it in an
Yes, it does terrible things to the entire world, and of course, religion is capable of doing good things as well. But it does terrible things. I mean, I recently read the story of this man who was 32 years old. He had a stroke on stage at a church event and realized he was having a stroke. There was a voice in his head that said, "You're having a stroke." You know how he interpreted that voice? He said, well, that's Satan. Satan is, and this is a true story. I'm not making this up. I'm actually going to do a video about it probably. But this guy was just like, well, it's got to be Satan. Satan is attacking me right now, which a lot of Christians believe is a perfectly reasonable thing to think. And so he didn't get treatment. He made his way back home, and he survived for that moment. And then family convinced him to go to the doctor, and the doctor said, "Yep, you had a stroke. That's not good, my guy." And he was like, "Well, okay, we'll start a treatment plan soon enough, I suppose." And shortly after that, he died on stage, apparently singing a song. The song that he'd been singing the first time he had the stroke, as I understand it. That one detail may be incorrect because the story was kind of hard to interpret, but as far as I'm aware, he died on stage singing the same song he'd been singing when he had the first stroke. And that's just one example of the harm religion does. If this man had not been religious, would he have died of a stroke? Well, possibly. People die of strokes all the time. That's nothing special. But maybe he would have been more inclined to get treatment if he didn't think he was being attacked by Satan, a figure from religion. Maybe if he actually heard in his head, "You're having a stroke," and was like, "Oh shit, I am," he would have gotten treatment and not died later. Now, we can't say that for sure, but we can say the risk of harm is certainly a lot greater when you dismiss the stroke you're having as Satan attacking you.
Ambiguous way. The lack of ambiguity is demonstrated by the consistent habit of relying on condescension, ridicule, and what Chesterton called the sneer. They don't just disagree, they consider the thing to be contemptible. And that
It is, but also, what is this mysterious sneer? Do I sneer? Do I have the sneer? I don't even know how to sneer. Whatever.
hatred can compel a person to refuse any possible evidence that might be presented to them, with more than a few leading atheists having admitted this kind of a prejudice. Because what kind of a person
I like how, the assumption of prejudice is one-sided. It's the atheist that has the prejudice that's totally unreasonable. Christians, of course, never have prejudice against atheists. Christians love atheists, don't they?
trying to position themselves as rational would open a debate by admitting that they are unwilling to consider any possible evidence that could be presented for the existence of God.
No, if you have evidence, present it to me and I will consider it accordingly. If it's not good enough, I will dismiss it. And you want to guess what's going to happen if this guy presents me quote unquote evidence? It's not going to be good enough. It's not really going to be evidence because all he has is a book. And I got news for you. Everybody's got a book. You got a book. The Jews got a book. The Muslims got a book. The Hindus got books. Buddhists got books. Taoists got books. Zoroastrians got books. Samaritans got... Everybody's got a book. And if you want me to believe your book, you better have some really good evidence for that outside of your book, which you do not, by the way.
Because that would be an admission that this isn't about reason or evidence.
But also, I could be convinced that there is a God, and the Christian God specifically. I could be convinced of that. I mean, it's not outside the realm of possibility. It would break reality as we know it, certainly, so it is outside the realm of possibility in that sense. But everything we know about everything could be wrong, I guess, and it's within the realm of possibility. I think the fact that it would break reality is a big problem in and of itself, but I'm just going to go ahead and accept it. You could convince me that Jesus is the big boy in heaven. You could convince me of that. The big problem is, while I would be intellectually honest enough to admit that were the case if I thought it were, if there were evidence for it, I would not worship this character because I do believe that even if he is real, the God of the Bible is not a character worthy of worship. Beyond that, I don't think humans are meant to worship anyway. I think worship is very unnatural to humans, generally speaking. I mean, there are some cases where it's kind of hot, I guess, but other than that, other than playing around, it's not something humans are naturally geared for. We do not worship. I mean, the idea that God gives us life so we should worship him, that's absurd. Your parents gave you life, and they may treat you really well, but if they demand you worship them, you're going to have a problem with that, and rightly so. So no, I would not worship your God. I would be perfectly fine admitting that God existed, but then I would have an entirely different argument which flows from what the other guy was saying earlier, which is this: your God is terrible and unworthy of worship, even if he is real.
Evidence for them, but rather their own preferences and prejudices. But when pressed on this question, I've seen some
Well, I mean, insofar as I have prejudices, they come from reading your book. I have read your book. In fact, I have a copy of it right there. There's a copy of the book right here. And not just one, there's 4 different texts in there, 4 different translations. I've read the book. That's where my prejudices about the book come from. It's not like I've never read the book and I just listened to Dawkins and was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In fact, half the time I think he's not making any sense at all lately, but you get the idea. Preferences, yes, I would say that just like you get your ideology from your preferences, so do I.
Leading atheists like Richard Dawkins and Peter Atkins come to mind, admit that there isn't any possible evidence that would persuade them. For example, if they were to witness like a miracle, some event that is impossible without supernatural intervention, which is the only kind of evidence that could exceed reasonable doubt, they would.
I don't think that's the only kind of evidence. I think that's certainly something. If a miracle happened, as you define it, what would that mean practically? That would mean something that has no possible naturalistic explanation. And the first question is, how do we know it has no naturalistic explanation? When we looked up at the cosmos, we realized, oh, the universe appears to be a lot more massive than anything we can actually see. That led us to conclude something else is going on here. We did not conclude that because we can't see the additional mass, that it's not there. We concluded it must have taken some other form. So the first question is, how do you prove that something was truly miraculous and supernatural? Now, there are, I guess you could say, exceptions to this. I think, for example, if the rapture happened and every Christian disappeared, that would be pretty good proof, I would think. So I do think even somebody like Dawkins could be convinced. Now, the outcome of that, who knows? But I think he could be convinced. I think the rapture would be pretty convincing to me. But again, I wouldn't really care a whole lot. It wouldn't change much for me, except I'd be kind of happy.
Rather conclude that they were hallucinating or had gone insane than admit that something supernatural had actually occurred. And of course,
Well, I mean, if something is happening that seems to break the laws of the universe, how do you know you haven't gone insane? I tell this story sometimes. My biological mother, I am adopted, my biological mother, she sees shadow people. She's seen ghosts. She's heard footsteps and moans and wails and all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, this woman is haunted in more ways than one. But this woman just everything. And these experiences are, of course, as some of you will realize, typical of schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar psychosis, brain problems in general. She's had this stuff for long enough that I think we can assume it's just something going on in her brain. Or maybe she's lying, but I don't think she is. I think she really has these experiences in her perception. How does she perceive these things? What does she perceive them to be? Well, she thinks the shadow people are like demons or something. She thinks the ghosts are like demons or something, or actual ghosts, who knows. But she does seem to genuinely believe in these things, and she's convinced I do too, even though I think all of that stuff is just stupid. But she does believe, like, that this is all related to, like, Jesus stuff, okay? She believes that these shadow people are related to the Jesus-y worldview, because she's Christian. I don't know how serious she is about it, but she is one, she claims to be. I take her at her word. She's a Christian. So she perceives this as being like part of the spiritual warfare between good and evil. But me, I have been around enough schizophrenics and people with psychosis that I recognize these as symptoms of that stuff, that if you take antipsychotics, that stuff goes away, usually. Um, so the question then becomes, how do you know you're not insane? How does my mother, for example, how does she prove that she's perfectly sane and really experiencing these things in a spiritual sense? See, that's a question that's very hard to answer, I think. So it is reasonable to assume that if something presumably supernatural were to occur, I could just be insane. I think it's more reasonable to think that I have gone insane, especially considering my family history, than to think something supernatural actually happened. Does that mean I would necessarily conclude that, I just split necessarily up into 2 words. Very fancy there. Does that mean I would necessarily conclude that that nothing happened? It was all in my head and just I was dreaming it or fantasy. Would I assume that necessarily? Well, no. But I think that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation of those events. I mean, if I experience what my mother has, I would definitely think that's psychosis. And I hope to not experience that.
This standard of skepticism, which I would claim is unreasonable, can be applied to anything. If I
Well, what makes it unreasonable?
hate the idea that the earth is round and the possibility of it being round agitates me to the point of anger and contempt for those who disagree with me, then any evidence, even evidence that I experience firsthand in support of this claim, is something that I could just chalk up to the failures of my own faculties of perception. Like my eyes and my brain are simply deceiving me. And if I did that, wouldn't that be evidence of my own irrationality on this subject?
No, that would be evidence that you have strong feelings about the subject. Strong feelings are not necessarily a sign that you've just gone completely unhinged and can't think logically anymore. You can be very mad about some things and still think logically. I mean, today I had an experience where I got very mad about something, and it's the kind of something that, yes, I had every right to be extremely mad about it. And it was somebody else's fault, for once, not mine. And when I came in to the room, I told them, I said, I am very, extremely upset about something right now. And we talked about it. That's what we did. I didn't throw a fit. I was very upset, very angry, and we talked about it. That's it. And you can still do that. You can make that choice. You can be very upset about something and still choose to respond rationally, logically. I didn't go in and start yelling at her. I just said, listen, I am very upset. I am very angry, and we have something to talk about. And we did. That's probably the most angry I have been in, God, I don't know how long. I mean, that was like the peak of my recent anger. But of course, this guy would hear me talking about Yahweh and be like, "Nuh-uh, you're much angrier about Skyman, magic Skyman being up there in the clouds. You're so mad."
Yes, it would. Which is why atheists who demonstrate such animosity towards theism and who refuse to allow any evidence to be presented to them should be treated in the same way. These are not rational people offering reasonable degrees of skepticism. These are people motivated by emotions and personal animus, and to whatever degree that they invoke their rational.
It's a lot of assumptions, I think. I mean, I make plenty of assumptions about Christians, reasoned assumptions, but I'm not about to invalidate their whole faith or why they have it on basis of their behaviors. If somebody tells me that they feel a certain way because of their faith, I just tend to accept that at mostly face value. Now, there are times when somebody will say something completely out of left field, like Big Nick is an expert at this, and I'll say, well, that sounds actually psychotic. But I'm not questioning his faith. I'm questioning how far his brain is misfiring to describe something. I mean, like the guy's flat Earth example there. I think it's very odd to say that, well, atheists are angry, so they're emotional, and you can just dismiss everything they think. I think that's really odd.
Faculties. It's at the service of their emotions and prejudices rather than the other way around. What I think is going on with a lot of the people who rail against the existence of God and anyone who supports that claim is described by C.S. Lewis in his autobiography, recounting the
Oh Lord, we're whipping out the C.S. Lewis. Everybody protect your ears. It's the nonsense of all nonsense. I don't know why they looked at this guy as some paragon. When I read C.S. Lewis, I mostly thought like, this is like the best they got. This is their guy. Um, I mean, I think like there are some things I've read where I've been like, huh, that's actually very interesting. Like, I mean, I think, and I hate to admit it, but I'm gonna. I think William Lane Craig is interesting in his arguments. Do I agree with them? Well, no. I think they have enormous gaping holes that you could fly a jet plane through. But uh, C.S. Lewis, very bad at like these arguments. But they're golden boys, so I guess we gotta have some of him now.
inconsistency of mind and heart that he suffered with when he was an atheist. He says this: I was at this time living like so many atheists or anti theists in a whirl of contradiction. I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. I was equally angry with him for creating a world.
See, this sort of thing is definitely like what makes C.S. Lewis not seem very serious to me. Like, um, you maintain that God did not exist. Okay, that's great. We're on the same page there. I was also very angry with God for not existing. Sure, that's fine, I guess. I mean, you can see the injustice of the world and wish there were a God to do something about it. That's perfectly reasonable. I disagree, but it's perfectly reasonable to make such a wish. I was equally angry with God for creating a world. Okay, this is where the whole thing just like collapses in on itself like a black hole, because if you were angry with God for creating a world, then you did believe in God. I am not angry with God for creating a world, but also I don't think that the world existing is a bad thing. So I guess like C.S. Lewis was just like terribly unhappy, which is perfectly reasonable, I guess. But the whole thing is just yes, he is a whirl of contradictions, which makes him a lot less serious. As I used to be an atheist story. You meet all kinds of these I used to be an atheist sorts of stories where they were just miserable, depressed people and they really did believe in God and just said they didn't or whatever. It's not credible. It's just not credible.
And that's reminiscent for me of another quote by G.K. Chesterton when he said, "The worst moment for an atheist is when he's really thankful and has no one to thank." And that's
What do you mean exactly? I think like when we are really thankful, we have at least one person to thank, ourselves, because we're all narcissists, right? All atheists are secretly evil, degenerate narcissists. Am I right, my guys? But typically in life, if I have something to be thankful for, I can at least share that experience with somebody. Even if they didn't like help with it, I can share it with them. And, why do you need somebody outside yourself to thank necessarily for something? It's a very odd quote. I don't know who G.K. Chesterton is, but G.K. Chesterton, or Chesterton, G.K. Chest, do better, okay? Just do better. He's probably dead. He's probably been gone a while, right?
that's true enough, but the reverse I think is also true for a lot of atheists in which they find themselves outraged about some perceived injustice in the world but have no one to direct their complaint to. As a Christian, I believe that God cares about my
Yeah, I think that could be a problem. I mean, so there was a miscarriage. That was no fun. Not my wife now, but my ex. It would have been mine, and I have big feelings over that, and I did at the time too. At the time, it was just them and I alone, in a big city, really far from family, who seemed very uninterested in the whole thing happening. Um, it just is despair like I've never felt before. Uh, the depths of despair, because like she could have like died. Obviously, the pregnancy was untenable. It was ectopic. Wouldn't make it in any way. There was no way for it. It just wasn't going to happen. Um, she had to have like a very risky surgery, considering how much blood she had already lost unknowingly. And it took way longer than expected, about twice as long, which scared me half to death. I was there all night pacing the halls, and then in the morning I had to like go across the city to like get her stuff, and just the isolation of such an experience, I think, is terrible for like anybody. I think even Christians going through that aren't going to find a whole lot of solace in praying about it. I don't think so. I think like they're going to turn to family like everybody else. But what do you do when your family sucks like mine kind of does? Well, you're just alone. You just got to deal with it. You don't have anybody. You've just got to sit with that despair. And I think despair teaches you things. I think despair teaches you a lot about yourself and your place in the world, as it were. I think that kind of isolation where you have nobody to talk to about something, I think that is an amazing teacher of terrible things. Um, but despite feeling all of that despair, and I remember very acutely, like it was really deep, dark, bad stuff. Despite all of that, um, I think that I gained a lot from actually having to look at it directly, not being able to look away. I didn't have somebody in the sky to give it all to and just be like, well, there we go, not my problem anymore. I had to stare it in the face. And I think there was some value in that. Now, does that mean that I'm glad I had the experience? Well, hell no. Especially since it wasn't just like my experience, it was also that person's experience, and they are super traumatized in like multiple ways and blame me for everything. So, thanks for that, universe. But I digress. The point here is simple. Yes, it sucks not having people to turn to. But I really would consider that more of a problem of just the universe is a very unfair place. There was nobody I could turn to who would relate in the way that I needed them to relate. So I had to deal with it. And there was no God there to help out with that, and I knew there wasn't, so it was pointless to even bother with that. And, yeah, just some things are terrible. Some things really suck. So do I hold my miscarriage against God, or do I hold the despair against God? Well, no, because he's not real. But I did learn how cruel and unfair the universe actually can be sometimes. I mean, as a white person in the West, at the time I had a fair amount of money, so I had that going for me. As that kind of privileged sort of person, I guess I'd grown to take a lot of things kind of for granted. And I think a moment like that just makes it clear how bad it is to take it all for granted, because how quickly things can change, how quickly you can go from everything is fine to everything is very much the exact opposite of fine. Um, it's the universe is a very unfair place, and yeah, I guess I'm glad to know that. I'm glad I know that because um, I can reflect upon that experience as just an unfortunate thing that happens in nature. It's just nature sometimes sucks. It's not God punishing me. It's not the devil out to get me. None of that stuff. It's just something that happens. And I think that's a much better attitude for somebody in that situation.
My prayers. And so there have been times when I've complained to him, I've raised my objection. And I also firmly believe that he honors those moments. He doesn't just rebuke me or smite me for it. He receives those strained expressions, it interacts with them, and leads me towards some kind of understanding about it. But the atheist
Okay, so you have a personal relationship with God and Jesus. What are their favorite colors? And I'm gonna ask you to. I'm gonna ask another person to like do this same test. I'm gonna ask another person who has a relationship with these figures. Actually, let's ask like 10 people. Ask this guy, my parents, a few other people. We're gonna ask like 10 people. What are God's favorite color and Jesus' favorite color? What are the favorite colors there? We're gonna have them write it down, and we're gonna see how close and personal this relationship is.
in the clip that I saw is distressed by historical events like the Holocaust and the seemingly arbitrary suffering of innocent people and children.
Seemingly arbitrary? No, it is completely arbitrary. But for the fact that actually Christianity has maligned Jews since the very beginning almost.
Well and good, so am I. But my objections
Let's not forget that the historical bigotries that led to the Holocaust originated from the blame being shifted from the Roman Gentiles over to the Jews over the course of the Gospels. Let's not forget that so much historical damage has been done by that one set of shifts across those Gospels. And the Holocaust is one of those things. The Holocaust directly descends from the genesis of your religion, as it were.
make sense in light of the fact that I believe in God who exists. If you don't believe there's anything more than matter and motion or the physical universe, on what grounds do you have to say that the world and the events captured in time should have been another way? Which is
Because I am a human just like you, and I have feelings just like you, and I have a sense of empathy, sympathy. I have a sense of justice just like you do. Fun fact, atheists are not robots devoid of emotion and feeling, usually. I mean, some are, I assume, but most aren't.
what we're doing when we make moral objections. To say that things should be other than they are is to accuse the physical universe of being other than what it should be. How can you say that if the physical universe is all that there is? Like,
No, you're missing something here, and the thing you're missing is this. If the universe is a naturalistic thing, I can think the Holocaust is bad. There is no divinity to say the Holocaust is objectively bad, so it comes down to subjective opinions on whether it actually was. And I think the answer is yes. I'm very against that kind of thing because I don't know how that feels, but I can imagine it feels probably not very good to be holocausted. It's not a very good thing at all. In our naturalistic universe, I think it's a terrible, unfair thing that happened to people because of one man being insane and getting a bunch of other people to follow him, all of them, no doubt, subject to these prejudices delivered from thousands of years of Christian tradition against the Jews. But if we are arguing in a hypothetical situation where your God exists, if you're telling me that your God exists, my response, then why Holocaust? That is a specific objection to the idea that your God exists. I can see why the Holocaust could happen in a universe where God does not exist. I cannot see any reason why the Holocaust should happen in a universe where a God exists. That's what's being missed here. That's the key ingredient that you're stepping away from a little bit.
If I were playing a video game and had fixed rules and code governing those rules, and something happens that I don't really like in the game, I might object and say that, yeah, it shouldn't have been configured that way, should have been a different way. But when I do that, I'm appealing, perhaps in a futile way, to the game developers. I'm saying they should have done this differently. But if there was no game developer, if the game was all that there was, on what grounds would I have to say it should have been made differently?
Because we are questioning by your standard. If the universe exists naturally, as I like to think it does, because there's no reason for it to exist in any other way, if the universe is just something natural, then yes, the happening of the Holocaust makes perfect sense as just one of the terrible things that happens. If this universe is ruled over by a god, specifically yours, it makes no sense. Anyway, this video has gone on long enough, so we're going to call it there. But thanks for watching, thanks for being here, and I hope you have a great one.